The SNES was never supposed to do what these games made it do. Nintendo's 16-bit hardware had real computational limitations. But between clever engineering, custom chips crammed into cartridges, and developers willing to spend months squeezing out every last drop of performance, the SNES produced visuals, audio, and gameplay complexity that shouldn't have been possible. Star Fox did something in 1993 that most developers considered impossible on consumer hardware. It rendered a fully 3D polygonal game on the SNES in real time. The Super FX chip packed inside the cartridge functioned as a dedicated graphics processor, handling the polygon math the console's main CPU couldn't manage. Without that chip, Star Fox simply doesn't exist. The polygonal environments and enemies are sparse by any modern measure, but context is everything here. Seeing Corneria's angular cityscape scroll past, or watching an R-ing bank and roll through an asteroid field in 1993 felt like science fiction made tangible. Argonaut Software and Nintendo built something genuinely new, and the SNES had no other game that looked remotely like it. Frame rate is the honest caveat. Star Fox runs at around 15 frames per second in busy sequences, and combat against multiple enemies simultaneously tests the Super FX chip's limits visibly. Some stages slow to a crawl during the most demanding moments, and that inconsistency is noticeable. What holds up is the design intelligence surrounding the technical feat, the branching level structure, the R and controls that reward precision flying, and the bosses designed to showcase 3D perspective in ways flat sprites couldn't. These decisions ensure Star Fox is more than a tech demo. The team understood that the polygon revolution needed to feel purposeful. The sequel, Star Fox 2, pushed the Super FX chip even further and was completed but unreleased until decades later. Evidence that the hardware team knew exactly where the ceiling was and kept finding ways to approach it. Super Mario RPG arrived in 1996 as one of the SNES' final major releases, and Square brought the full weight of their technical expertise to making it feel like a proper send-off. The pre-rendered 3D visuals, the same technique Rare pioneered, are used with more restraint and deliberate artistry here, creating isometric environments with a dimensional warmth that Donkey Kong Country's jungles never quite achieved. Every environment reveals new angles through architectural detail. Characters move through with animation cycles suggesting weight. Mario's run, Bowser's lumbering stride, Mallow's bounce, each distinct and fluid. The battle system layers time button mechanics over traditional turn-based structure, requiring active player engagement throughout every fight. That decision meant animating attacks that responded to input timing, which complicated the rendering workload considerably. Action commands triggered visual feedback that had to communicate clearly within the SNES limited palette. Yoko Shimomura's soundtrack was built to complement that technical ambition. Layered arrangements that used the sound chip's full capacity while maintaining the melodic accessibility the Mario franchise demanded. The campaign is short by RPG standards, and the narrative, while charming, resolves its central conflict before fully exploring the world it establishes. The difficulty is low enough that mechanical engagement sometimes substitutes for genuine challenge. As a collaboration between Nintendo and Square at peak power, Super Mario RPG demonstrates what the SNES looked like when being deliberately celebrated on its way out. F-Zero launched with the SNES in 1990, and Nintendo chose it specifically to demonstrate what Mode 7 could do. The flat texture mapping technology that Mode 7 enabled, rotating and scaling a 2D plane in real time, had never appeared in a consumer gaming context before, and its racing courses demonstrated its most visceral application. The sensation of speed across a receding track surface that creates genuine three-dimensionality from a 2D operation. The track surfaces scroll toward the player at speeds that communicated velocity in a way 2D sprite scaling couldn't match. Curves bank by rotating the plane rather than animating individual objects. Track edges and barriers are rendered through a combination of scaling trickery and sprite layering that holds up under scrutiny. The illusion is constructed carefully and maintains itself through the course's most demanding sections. F-Zero demonstrated Mode 7 ceiling as well as its floor in competitor rendering. Other vehicles are sprites that scale as they approach rather than genuine 3D objects, and at high speed, the limitations of that technique become visible. The sensation of the track itself is convincing. The population of that track is more fragile. Course design used those limitations intelligently. Tight corners testing Mode 7 rotation, long straights maximizing the speed illusion, elevation suggested through scaling tricks. The racing itself is immediate and demanding. Vehicle handling has genuine weight, course memorization matters, and a lack of combat keeps the focus on driving skill. This set the standard for Mode 7 use, and nothing on the SNES surpassed its demonstration of pure speed. Mega Man X3 represents Capcom's final attempt to extract maximum performance from the base SNES hardware without custom chip assistance. And the results show both what the console could sustain and where it genuinely ran out of headroom. Released in 1995, this is the franchise's most technically demanding SNES entry. More enemies, more animation frames, more simultaneous effects than either predecessor. Boss fights display complex enemy animations while maintaining the player's full movement set simultaneously. Certain stages populate the screen with multiple enemy types, and the SNES manages this with less slowdown than the ambitions had any right to expect. Environmental effects pushed the hardware noticeably. Gravity Beetle's stage uses scaling effects that strain the processor. Blizzard Buffalo's ice surfaces create reflection elements that cost frame rate in specific sections. The game uses these moments deliberately, deploying effects where they reinforce level identity even knowing performance will dip. The audio quality represents the sound chip ceiling. The compositions are dense and layered, using all available channels with arrangements that feel orchestral in intent. This is the clearest example of the X series' sound design ambition: melody, percussion, and atmospheric texture operating simultaneously. But it loses ground somewhat in design precision. Stages are more complex without being more interesting. Certain sections rely on navigating dense environments rather than testing the movement skills the series built its reputation on. As a technical document of what the SNES could produce in 1995, X3 is genuinely impressive. As a game, it sacrifices some elegance for spectacle. Tales of Phantasia has a legitimate claim to being the most technically demanding game ever released on the Super Famicom. The 1995 Namco RPG arrived on a 6 MB cartridge, the largest ever used for the system, and filled that space with an audio presentation so ambitious it redefined what players expected from console game music and voice performance. Full vocal performances during battle were unprecedented on the platform. The SNES sound chip wasn't designed for recorded audio at this quality. Namco's engineers compressed heavily to fit those samples. The compression is audible, but getting recognizable performances out of the hardware at all remains impressive. The soundtrack itself pushed the sound chip through arrangements of unusual complexity. Multi-layered compositions with orchestral ambition used the chip's 8 audio channels simultaneously in ways most developers reserve for 1 or 2 dominant instruments. The opening theme became immediately famous for demonstrating what 16-bit audio could sound like when engineers refused to accept its limitations as final. The real-time linear motion battle system, the first appearance of what became the Tales series' signature combat, rendered side-scrolling battles with fluid character movement and responsive controls that turn-based contemporaries couldn't replicate in terms of player engagement. Tales of Phantasia never reached Western players originally. The localization only arrived through a fan translation, with an official Western release coming to GBA years later. The cartridge size, voice work, audio ambition, and battle system together make the clearest argument the SNES had unrealized potential in its final years. Street Fighter Alpha 2 on SNES in 1996 shouldn't have been possible. The original arcade version ran on CPS-2 hardware that outclassed the Super Nintendo dramatically. Higher resolution, more colors, faster processing, more memory. Capcom's conversion team had to make brutal decisions about what to preserve and what to sacrifice, and the result sits in a specific category of technical achievement. Remarkable for existing at all. Character sprites retained their core animation sets, with surprisingly minimal degradation. The movement and attack animations that define the Alpha series' visual identity survive the downgrade with enough fidelity that the game reads clearly as Alpha 2 rather than an imitation. Capcom prioritized the gameplay feel, the air blocking, the Alpha counters, the chain combo system, and those mechanics translated accurately. The concessions are visible. Resolution dropped, color counts reduced, backgrounds lost detail. Loading between character select and match start takes longer than arcade players expected. Music quality suffered, but frame rates held. That prioritization, animation completeness over visual polish, was the right engineering call, and it's why the SNES version remains playable today rather than feeling like a compromised artifact. Without the speed and response accuracy of the CPS-2, competitive play exposes timing differences that casual players never notice but dedicated players feel immediately. This was always a home experience rather than an arcade substitute. That a coherent, mechanically functional Alpha 2 existed on SNES at all remains a quiet engineering triumph the hardware profile never should have allowed. Yoshi's Island arrived in 1995, carrying a distinct visual philosophy, and a custom chip called the Super FX2 that let Nintendo realize it completely. Instead of chasing the pre-rendered realism Rare demonstrated with Donkey Kong Country, Shigeru Miyamoto's team went in the opposite direction. Crayon textures, watercolor backgrounds, hand-drawn aesthetics that made the entire game look like an illustrated children's book brought to life. Sprites rotate and scale throughout. Enemies tumble. Objects spin with perspective depth. The Super FX2 produced animations the base hardware couldn't generate, and enormous boss fights scale sprites to fill the screen while remaining fluid. Background layers stack with an intricacy that rewards attention. Foreground elements cast soft shadows. Transparency effects. Baby Mario's star invincibility bubble. Certain enemy attacks. Use the SNES limited color palette inventively. The whole game demonstrates that visual style and technical sophistication aren't competing priorities. The gameplay reinforces the aesthetic distinctiveness. The egg-throwing mechanic, the flutter jump, the transformation sequences all feel designed around what the hardware could display rather than working against it. Where it loses players is pacing. Stages can overstay their welcome, and the Baby Mario crying mechanic generates frustration that feels at odds with the game's warm visual tone. As a technical and artistic statement, Yoshi's Island remains one of the SNES library's clearest arguments that hardware limitations become irrelevant when creativity drives the engineering. Donkey Kong Country landed in 1994 like a technical earthquake. Rare had been experimenting with silicon graphics workstations, the same hardware used for Jurassic Park CGI, and used them to pre-render 3D character models, then downscale and import the resulting sprites into the SNES. The result was something nobody believed was running on Nintendo's hardware. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong moved with a fluidity and dimensional depth that the system had never produced before. What makes the achievement hold up under scrutiny is how Rare used the technique across the entire game. Enemies, bosses, environmental objects, everything carries that pre-rendered solidity. The jungle backdrops layer parallax, scrolling with atmospheric lighting effects, creating depth that the SNES Mode 7 couldn't replicate through geometry alone. Rain streaks across the screen in specific stages. Minecart levels generate a sense of speed that felt genuinely dangerous. David Wise's soundtrack used the sound chip to produce atmospheric textures most composers ignored. Underwater stages achieved ambient depth that influenced game music for years. The gameplay itself is tight and confident, with level design that uses the visual spectacle purposefully rather than decoratively. Though the control precision definitely shows its era. Some sections demand timing the hardware doesn't always reward cleanly. Certain enemy placements feel designed around memorization rather than reaction, which makes first runs through unfamiliar stages punishing. Star Ocean pushed the SNES so hard it needed its own custom chip to function. The SDD1 compression chip packed inside the cartridge was essential. Without it, the game's enormous data requirements couldn't fit on available media. Tri-Ace's 1996 debut was aggressively ambitious for a console already yielding ground to the PlayStation, and the technical demands reflected that ambition at every level. Real-time combat rendered multiple characters on 3D perspective battlefields with spell effects filling the screen. For a Super Famicom title releasing alongside early PS1 games, the visual density was remarkable. Frame rate maintained stability through most encounters. Town environments layer multiple parallax scrolling planes with a depth that made exploration feel dimensional. Character sprite work is detailed and expressive, with animation frames suggesting motion beyond what the hardware typically budgeted. The voice samples, compressed fragments of battle dialogue, were technically innovative even if the audio quality suffered from the compression. The private action system required maintaining multiple conditional states simultaneously, demanding programming to keep stable. Star Ocean shows its limits in the compression artifact. Certain graphical elements display subtle distortion from the SDD1 chip's work. Low transitions between some areas break immersion. The localization only arrived via fan translation, leaving the original release inaccessible to Western players for years. Star Ocean treated the SNES like it still had years of potential. Technically, it proved that argument. Trials of Mana was released in 1995 as Square's most visually ambitious action RPG, and the hardware strain is both visible and irrelevant, because what they achieved in spite of it represents the SNES at its most beautiful. This is a game that treats color as a technical resource, deploying the system's palette with an artistry that makes every environment feel painted rather than rendered. 6 playable characters with fully animated movement sets, each distinct in profile. Enemies across diverse biomes maintain animation quality under visual complexity. The SNES carries active sprites alongside waterfalls, foliage, and atmosphere particles with only occasional visible compromise. Class change sequences push the hardware through transformation animations of unusual smoothness. Character sprites shift through multiple forms with transition frames that suggest 3D rotation on hardware that can't perform it. The visual commitment to making those moments feel significant shows in the animation budget allocated to them. Mode 7 appears in specific dungeons, rotating floors signaling locations of unusual importance. Selective deployment makes those moments land harder. But the technical ambition creates friction in maintaining frame rate. Certain stages with dense enemy populations and heavy layering slow noticeably. The ring menu system, while functional, required holding multiple menu states in memory that contributed to occasional performance dips during combat. The soundtrack stretches the sound chip through arrangements dense enough to suggest a live ensemble. As a final showcase of what the SNES could do with color, sprite work, and audio simultaneously, Trials of Mana makes a persuasive closing argument. Chrono Trigger is what happens when the most technically capable RPG studio of the era applies its full resources to a platform they've spent years mastering. Released in 1995, this is Square at peak SNES competence. Every technical tool available deployed in service of a game that never draws attention to its own engineering because the execution is seamless. Toriyama's designs animate with personality earlier SNES RPGs didn't approach. Characters communicate emotion through movement cycles. Battle animations use the full color budget with spell effects layering transparency, scaling, and color rotation. The absence of random encounters meant every enemy sprite needed to exist in the exploration environment with its own animation cycle. Managing dozens of active sprites with distinct behaviors without visible performance degradation required careful memory management. Battle environments are hand-painted with a depth that makes each encounter feel located in the world rather than abstracted into an arena. The seamless transition between exploration and combat, no screen wipe, no loading, required holding both states in memory simultaneously, which should have been impossible given the hardware's constraints. Yasunori Mitsuda's soundtrack used a sound chip with a range, folk instruments, orchestral arrangements, electronic textures, that made the 8 available channels sound like more than they were. Chrono Trigger shows limits in scope rather than execution. The game's deliberate length keeps every system at peak quality, but leaves the world feeling smaller than the depth of its craft suggests it could sustain. The technical achievement is invisible. That's exactly what makes it perfect. Terranigma arrived in 1995 as one of the final commercial releases for the SNES in Europe and Japan, and Quintet designed it to look like a final statement rather than a routine late-generation title. The visual presentation combines Mode 7 environmental transitions, layered parallax backgrounds of unusual depth, and sprite work that holds up against the best the platform produced in any year. The opening sequence establishes the ambition immediately. Animated skies, atmospheric lighting shifting between spaces, character animations suggesting genuine weight. Quintet understood the SNES layering system well enough to create depth without 3D processing. Boss encounters scale sprites in ways that use the hardware's scaling functions to suggest size beyond what fixed-dimension sprites could communicate. Some of the game's largest bosses use Mode 7 for their arena floors, while layering scaled enemies above, combining multiple hardware techniques simultaneously. The soundtrack operates at a similar level of ambition. Arrangements use the sound chips channels with an orchestral density that most SNES composers reserve for single high-impact moments. It maintains that density consistently. It loses some technical ground in frame rate during particularly dense scenes. Certain areas with heavy parallax layering and active enemies show visible slowdown. A few dungeon environments prioritize mechanical design over visual ambition and feel comparatively sparse. Terranigma's real distinction is how the visual and audio achievement serves the tone rather than existing separately from it. The technical ambition and the emotional weight of the game push in the same direction.